Thank you very much, Leanne. So for this session, I have the absolute pleasure of speaking to Fred Swaniker, founder of the African Leadership Group. Now, Fred, I know that for many people, you don't need any introduction, but for those who don't know you, given that you're speaking to a global audience today, could you just say a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, firstly, Nomsa, for having me in this conversation. I'm originally from Ghana, but I think of myself more as an African today because I left Ghana at the age of 4. And every 4 years of my life, I moved to a different country in Africa. So I lived in Gambia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mauritius. Because of my love for Africa, I started thinking about what would it really take to make this continent meet its full potential. And what I came to realize from all my experience of living and working in different parts of Africa was that our true wealth lay not in our gold and our diamonds, but in our people. And that unless we developed our capacities, our human capacity, we wouldn't really be able to achieve our full potential. So I've been involved in the field of education for the last almost 20 years, because I really believe that leadership capacity is one of the greatest human capacities that we need on the continent. And so, that's what led me to start the African Leadership Group, which is a series of institutions on the continent with an ambition of developing 3 million leaders for Africa by 2035.
So with that introduction, let's step back a little bit and just sort of look at education at a macro level. What is the most critical challenge we face in Africa right now when it comes to education?
Big challenges that I see when it comes to education. One is access, and the other one is quality. In Africa, if you look at enrollment rates, which is basically the percentage of people who are enrolled in education that is appropriate for that age group. Across Africa, the primary school enrollment rate is about 80%. So, a lot of governments, because of the World Bank and the Millennium Development Goals, really focus on primary education. But when you go to secondary, that number drops to 40%. And then when you go to university, that number drops to about 10%. That 10% compares to about 30% in China and India, and about 60 to 70% in Western developed economies. As you move further up the levels of education, access gets less and less, and so we have a large number of people. There are about 20 million people who come out of high schools in Africa every year, and universities can only absorb about 2 million of them. So that's the access problem. Then the second challenge is quality. Once people are in school, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of what they're getting is good, right? So we have a huge challenge there where people are receiving education that isn't necessarily relevant for our times. It's not preparing them for employment. People who can think critically and who can communicate and really be ready for the 21st century. Technology is becoming another need for our education systems, especially post-COVID. We're realizing that there's a huge need for digital skills. And are we ready for that? Or is this going to be another wave that will leave Africa behind? So these are some of the challenges that we face, and we have to really think differently and use innovation if we're going to actually come out of this quagmire.
So tell us, what is the mission of the African Leadership Group, and how do you plan to tackle these education challenges?
Well, our mission is to transform Africa by educating its future leaders. We started with a small goal about 17 years ago of trying to educate 6,000 leaders. And over time, we've now increased as we've actually made more progress. And we're now set our sights on a bigger goal, which is 3 million leaders by 2035. And the way we are doing this is through different institutions. We started first with the African Leadership Academy, which is a 2-year boarding school in South Africa where we select outstanding young people from all across Africa. They come and we educate them. We also prepare them for entry into universities around the world. In that institution, we found that 80% of our graduates would leave Africa and go and study at Harvard and Stanford and Yale. So today we have about 400 of our graduates attending colleges in the US, the top universities. And so that, it was great to see that our talent was, world class, and that they could go and compete at the best university in the world. But a couple of things troubled me. One is the fact that, that our best talent was leaving Africa for their education, for the next stage of their education. So, We need our own Stanford and Harvard and Yale in Africa. And the second thing that was troubling me was the fact that we were able to only admit about 125 students a year from 4,000 applicants. So there was a massive need for what we're doing. So I realized that we needed to extend this vision to do it at the tertiary level and also to do it at larger scale. And that's what led us to create the African Leadership University. If you're going to build a world-class university like Oxford, you need 1,000 years, and you need thousands of professors with PhDs, and you need billions of dollars. We don't have any of those three things in Africa. We don't have 1,000 years. We have 15 years before we have the largest workforce in the world, larger than China and India. And by the end of this century, Africa will be 40% of the entire world's population. So we need to move fast. We can't do this in 1,000 years.
How are you planning to disrupt then this traditional higher education model?
You see, most education was built in an era, or higher education really, was built in an era where information was scarce. So you had to go to the university to get the knowledge from the head of the professor or from the library book. But today we live in a world where information is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so a child in a rural area in Africa today has access to more information on their mobile phone than someone who was doing a PhD at Oxford 30 years ago. And the problem is that most universities, even in the West, have not realized this, and they still think they have a monopoly on knowledge. You can now get access to, the best lectures from the top universities in the world. So what we have done is basically the three main innovations in ALU. The first is we have shifted the focus of the learning from the professor to the student. If we were building the university around professors, we would be building it around a scarce resource that we don't have. But the minute you flip it and make it the entire learning model being based on the student, where they can teach themselves using all this information that they now have, they can teach each other through peer-to-peer learning, and then they can still have some limited faculty intervention, but now you can leverage that person a lot more, and they don't necessarily have to be a person with a PhD. So that's the first thing. And so now that makes it fundamentally scalable, because now it's built around an abundant resource, not around a scarce resource. The second thing differently is we're getting rid of academic majors. We got rid of academic majors because most universities give you a menu of Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry, Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, Bachelor of Arts in History, and that menu was often created 50 years ago, and it's based on the interests of the faculty, not necessarily on the interests of the students. But the fact is that the world is changing so fast that what you study in college is rarely likely to be what you're going to work in. And with artificial intelligence and automation, a lot of jobs are being made obsolete. So what we believe is that we rather need to create problem solvers who have learned how to learn and who have learned how to solve problems versus people who have memorized a set of facts and figures. So we give our students a menu of what we call the 7 grand challenges facing Africa. Big problems like healthcare, climate change, governance, etc. And we ask them not to choose a major, but to choose a mission. Declare how you are going to solve one of these problems and then build your learning experience around it. And then the final thing that we're doing differently is in the way in which the learning happens. So research from, for example, from the Center for Creative Leadership shows that when you, to effectively develop a skill, only 10% of it can be learned in the classroom. 10% is learned from your peers and mentors and what they call developmental relationships, and 70% is learned by doing, from experience. Yet today, most education is focused only on that 10%.
So 2020 was a tumultuous year for education around the world, and I'm sure it's had some impact on your thinking and outlook. How has the pandemic, how has the pandemic changed the education landscape, not just in Africa, but globally? And what effect has it had on your thinking and your plans?
One of the things I always believe is that constraints drives innovation, right? And so when we had the constraints of the pandemic, it forced us to think about things very differently. And so what we are doing now is using this moment to actually scale faster by leveraging a lot more technology and breaking up the way that learning works. So for example, before you would have to come to one of our campuses in Mauritius or Rwanda for 3 years. Now that was very expensive, right? It cost about $15,000 to come to Mauritius, but about 2/3 of that cost had nothing to do with education. It was the cost of an air ticket to Mauritius, $2,000. Food for $3,000. Housing before I put you in the classroom, I spent $10,000. Right? So what we're now doing is we're shifting our model to one where you'll come to Mauritius or Rwanda only for 4 months to kick off your university education. You'll meet your peers, you'll inculcate the vision, the values in you, and you get to really understand and build the foundation of your learning. But then we send you back home for the rest of your 3-year degree. And you then spend the time in a hub, where in the hub, it's just a space in different, so now instead of having 2 campus immersions in Rwanda, we'll have 2 campuses and 40 to 50 hubs around Africa. And in these hubs, think of it like a co-working space where there's no faculty, but you just have internet access, electricity, and most importantly, community. Because the best learning is social. One of the reasons why people go to college is to build relationships with their friends and to do peer learning and clubs and activities. So you can still get all that, right? And you can do the learning online, and then you do the learning in person through the projects and all that stuff. But you now save all the costs of the flights and the food and the housing, which were not really adding much value. And with this now, we're reducing the cost of attending the university from $15,000 to $2,000. And then we're going to be able to scale up from our current 2,000 students to about 20,000 students in the next 5 years. So these are some of the innovations that we're using this moment to do. And you can also imagine now with these hubs, we can now have visiting professors from all around the world coming to spend time in these hubs doing residencies. We can tap into the local business community to come and teach in these hubs. So there's so many exciting opportunities that we see. And that's why I say constraints drives innovation. And I think that if the world doesn't ignore some of the lessons we've learned from the experiments that have happened in education, this could be a real dawn in a new era for education around the world.
But what do you think are the relevant skills graduates will need to be future ready and more employable?
That's an excellent question. So we actually did research with this. We interviewed about 200 employers around the world to find out what are the skills they typically find missing in college graduates. And from that, we mapped out what we call the 7 meta skills of the 21st century. And what employers told us is that they wish graduates would come to them with, number 1, critical thinking skills, right? Ability to think for themselves, to solve problems, and ask the right questions. Critical thinking is number 1. Communication is another critical skill that employers are really looking for. Leading yourself is critical. Leading others, so in teams and collaboration, etc. Data analysis and decision making is a really important thing that employers are looking for there, because with the emergence of sensors and data, there's so much that you've got to be able to analyze and use to make decisions, financial modeling and so on. They're also looking for project management. Can you take a complex task, break it down into smaller bits, and then come up with a project to actually implement it? And then finally, the 7th meta skill is entrepreneurial thinking. Can you look at a challenging problem and come up with creative ways to solve it with limited resources? So these are the skills that we think will always be in fashion, whether artificial intelligence takes your job or not. If you have these skills, you can learn new things and remain more relevant. And so one of the things we do in the university is that the entire first year is dedicated to imparting to all our students these 7 meta skills. So everyone goes to the same program. It's called the Leadership Core in their first year before they pick their mission, where we try and get them to really acquire these 7 meta skills to make them readily employable. And we're finding exceptionally high levels of employment amongst our graduates because of that.
Tell us about the room.
So what the room is basically is a community that we're building, where we're inviting, mid-career people and senior people who have the social capital, who have access to opportunities, into the room, and giving them a chance to, share their knowledge, their wisdom, their expertise with this next generation of talent, and also to open doors for them, right? So in this way, we're creating this powerful community that will provide the social capital that this next generation of leaders in Africa needs to be able to access their first internship, their first job, and when they start a company, they're looking for venture capital, they'll be able to do that, access to speaking opportunities, to fellowships and scholarships, and then that can really help them to proceed in life. We've also flipped our economic model, where instead of charging students fees up front to get the education, they go for education for free at a place like ALX, and then they sign a subscription to the room, where every month when they're employed, they pay a small amount, $25 or $50 a month, to get access to the room. And so what that does is basically one generation of graduates pays it forward for the next generation of graduates. And so not only is it giving them opportunity, but it's also ensuring they have a sustainable financial model.
Right. What are some of the exciting partnerships with companies that you've succeeded in striking for the room?
We've started some exciting collaborations with Amazon about developing some software engineers for them with Salesforce.com, with Kinsey, with HCL in India. There are a lot of companies that are looking for technology talent. So we are training several 100,000 software engineers in Africa. Today, Facebook or Google pay about $200,000 for a fresh college graduate to be a software engineer. In Africa, you can find them for $10,000, right? So we think there's a huge opportunity for us to export our talent, but without the brain drain. And I think that's what COVID has allowed us to do, is that companies are a lot more open to remote talent. So we're developing software engineers, data scientists, other kinds of technology talent, digital skills that we can then, through the room, make available to the whole world. And these are some of the exciting partnerships that we're seeing.
Could you give us maybe one or two examples of some of the lives that you have changed through ALA, ALU, ALX, and how do you measure your impact?
There's a YouTube series called Redefining Expectations that anyone can go and watch. It can really document some of the stories, but maybe I'll touch on a couple of this. A young man called William Kamkwamba, who, we came through the African Leadership Academy. At the time, he had been sitting at home for about 6 years in Malawi because his parents couldn't afford to pay school fees for him to go to high school. He went to a library and saw a picture of a windmill in the book, and he was able to use his own ingenuity to build a windmill using tractor parts and bicycle fan and things like that. And he managed to figure out how to generate electricity from this thing. But he then sat at home, and eventually we discovered him and we brought him into the academy. And when we found him, even though he was almost 20 years old, he was at the 4th grade level in terms of his academic development. Within 2 years of working with him, we were able to get him to Dartmouth, to an Ivy League university. He graduated in 4 years with a B average, published a book that became a bestseller, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, and today you can watch that movie on Netflix about this young man, and he's transformed. He's now built a school in Malawi. He's educating about 1,000 students and really having a lot of impact. There's another young man who was a street kid in Kenya 10 years ago, and he came through our program. He went to Yale eventually, and then he ended up coming back to Kenya at the age of 28 and running to be a senator. And he came second in the race against people who are on their 60s and 70s. There's a woman who has developed a technology for screening women for cervical cancer without using a speculum. So there's so many amazing and young people that are coming out of this institution. And we measure impact ultimately not by the grades that our students get and by the universities that they go into, by the lives that they touch. How many people do they impact through the innovations that they come up with, through the leadership that they provide in civil society? How many jobs do they create as they become entrepreneurs? And that is really how we measure our impact.
My final question to you is, what keeps you up at night and what excites you about the future?
What keeps me up at night is, creating all opportunities for all these millions of young leaders that we're developing in Africa. And that, as I mentioned, Africa is going to be the largest workforce in the world by 2035. We're going to be 40% of the world's population by the end of the century. And we have the youngest population in the world. The average age of an African is 19. The average age of a German or Japanese is 47. So how do we create opportunity? How do we grow our economies fast enough? How do we create entrepreneurs who can employ all this talent that is emerging in Africa? That's what keeps me up at night. What am I most excited about? Is the young people. Every time I meet a young person and I see the energy, the ideas, the passion that they have, and the fact that, I am fortunate to work with someone who could be the next Nelson Mandela, the next African Bill Gates, the next Mo Ibrahim. And so it's really exciting and fulfilling to be able to work with, game changers, innovators, entrepreneurs who can really solve not only Africa's problems, but some of the world's biggest problems. And so that is really why I wake up every day and what keeps me motivated.
Well, Fred, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for being part of this Rotary Centennial Africa Conference. We look forward to seeing where you are in 5 years from now.
And all the best for the rest of the conference.